John O'Sullivan, president of the Danube Institute, talking to you from a very hot day in Budapest. I see that my two guests and friends in their different parts of the world, Paris and the United States, are also having very different kinds of weather. Anne-Elisabeth, you look as though you're on your way to an extremely glamorous party. I think Daniel and I are obviously really more equipped for a barbecue. Now, having said that, we're here because we're going to discuss the French elections, which take place over the next 2 weekends. Turning to the viewers, let me just say to you that, like me, you're privileged to be listening into a conversation between two people who are really the best people to talk about French politics. Anne-Elisabeth Moutet of the London Sunday Telegraph, also the daughter of a distinguished French political family. I believe your grandfather refused to sign to support the National Assembly vote in 1940 for a settlement of the war.
For giving full powers to Marshal Pétain.
Yes, and giving and resisting the powers going to Pétain. Yes. Now, we in Britain, as you know, and in Budapest too, actually, we think of France as being beset by political crises over the years. That's not quite fair, but it is developing a particularly interesting one now. Now, let me turn briefly to Daniel Mahoney. Daniel Mahoney is a distinguished political philosopher, a distinguished expert on French political theory and political philosophers, and also somebody who has a deep knowledge of Catholic political philosophy as well. So all of these different qualifications you both possess make you very eligible to discuss the political crisis developing in France, which may or may not be resolved by the two elections, the election in two sets this weekend and next weekend. When we're going to see, obviously in the 2 weeks, what happens in these polls. But let me ask you, what was the significance, in your view, of the election results? I mean, he obviously took this as a great threat, but in your view, if your analysis, how would you say what would you say was the true and perhaps not that important significance of the result in the European elections?
Is that me or Daniel?
Oh, I was asking you, and I was going to hand over to Daniel after that. Yeah.
The European elections are, essentially they are the best life-size poll. Yeah. What they are not, especially in a country like France, there are other countries where it's different. So they're mostly not about European policies. There is a fraction of the French electorate who are sovereigntist and anti-EU as it is now. They don't want to get out of the European Union, but they really want to change the European Union from the inside. And that message was sent fairly clearly. But mostly people were saying, look, Emmanuel Macron embodies exactly what we don't like in our lives nationally, which is top-down interventionism, technocratic constraints, a number of things that we don't understand and that we feel is not taking our everyday interests at heart. And that when we can go on, when we got some sort of give and take. But it was sending a very powerful message. I don't think anybody expected him to dissolve the House 1 hour after he got it.
No. Can I turn to Daniel now and ask him what his response to the question about the European elections, and then move on from that to what you think? Yeah.
I have to say, Anne-Marie wrote an extremely lucid and penetrating piece for Unheard about the soulless, technocratic character, not only of Macron's thinking, but of his person and bearing. And I think what so many American observers don't sufficiently appreciate is just how empty and arrogant this kind of French centrism is. Macronie is the whole world of Macron First of all, Macron is unable to speak about France to France. You know, he loves the Gaullist trappings of the presidency of the Fifth Republic, but he doesn't have a sense of French nationhood in any profound or serious way. He is aloof. He doesn't listen even to advisors in his own camp, as I think Anne-Marie pointed out very nicely. The impulsiveness and the arrogance underlying the decision to call parliamentary elections. I would add that with Macron, the constant changing of emphasis and orientation. I mean, when you think about it, what are his two last major initiatives besides, imposing pension reform without legislative support? They are, somehow responding to the Dobbs decision in the United States without understanding it. And, Simone Veil back in the 1970s, when France allowed, by American standards, modest abortion, not abortion on demand, it was never a constitutional right. So for him to come in and constitutionalize it with no understanding of what the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled about federalism and abortion, and now pushing a Canadian and Belgian style euthanasia, I mean, he's just flailing. And then I think this really dangerous talk about French military intervention to fight the Russians in Ukraine. I mean, in the Cold War, we had a little nuclear prudence, maybe a little too much prudence. We probably could have done something to help the Hungarians in 56 or to tear down the wall in 61. But to send French troops to fight the Russians is madness. And so this man who claims to be the embodiment of moderation was rejected by the vast majority of the French people, who dislike his tone, his manner, his imperious presence. And he also managed to, I mean, as Alain Finkielkraut said in an interview with Le Point, you can't just go on appealing to the threat of the brown plague forever. Nobody really believes National Rally is a fascist party. As Alain Finkielkraut said in his interview, people who vote for the National Rally today basically are worried about the Islamicization of France. They're worried about and Macron has nothing to say about this, the threat to any minimal sense of national and traditional continuity. And lastly, they're beginning, it's true from an American conservative point of view, the political economic program of the National Rally is more statist than Anglo-American conservatives would like, but they're dead set against the mad new green new policies, the apocalyptic climate change stuff and all that. So, as Finkielkraut is one of the wisest men in France and a French Jew, said he may be voting for the National Rally to save France from the anti-Semitism of France Insoumise. The other thing Macron did in his reaction that Anne-Marie so nicely described to the June 9th election results was he pushed even the more moderate elements, like Glucksmann from the Socialist Party, the son of the Nouvelle Philosophe, André Glucksmann, had gone out of his way to sort of liberate the center-left socialists from the mad revolutionary yearnings and the deep, the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, the hard leftism of Mélenchon and France Insoumise. And now all these political groupings are part of this new Popular Front, and it's being driven by the hard left. So I think the election of June 9th was clearly, and Emery's absolutely right, these one sign that Europe as a political project doesn't exist is the European elections are always about national politics. But I want to add just one thing to the election results. I think the successor grouping to the old neo-Gaullists, les Républicains, they blew it in a sense for a long. When push comes to shove, these so-called successors of General de Gaulle sided more with Brussels than with a kind of Gaullist understanding of national integrity and national sovereignty. They're obviously split. They've split since the election, but in the last presidential campaign, the Républicains, who do have real conservative and national elements in the party, but they did very, very poorly under a weak candidate, getting 7.2% of the votes in the parliamentary election. And then to see so many of the party leaders respond in a morally preening way, the worst thing possible is any kind of electoral accommodation with the national rally. Well, did they really want Mélenchon and France Insoumise to radicalize France beyond recognition? So I think my friend Pierre Manon likes to say that a big part of the problem is what he calls the fanatisme de centre, the fanaticism of the center. They think they're in the middle, but they don't stand for the things that genuine centrists ought to stand for. And so if they want to know why people are turning elsewhere, it's because they've seized. They too don't know how to speak to France.
Let me intervene here because I want to raise this question about the so-called collapse of the legacy parties or with Anne-Elisabeth. Of the both left and right, the Gaullists on the one hand, the socialists on the other. I mean, it looks as though the parties we think of as the governing parties of France have almost ceased to exist.
I spent quite some time saying this in recent years, and I now think that what Macron imposed on the country, campaigning in 2017 out of nowhere, and sort of calling for en même temps, the great sort of sign is at the same time. You could keep both right and both left, and then he cherry-picked people from both sides. And essentially what he did is he put political life in stasis. And he made those parties disappear. And I would say that the legacy politicians are more or less dead. I'm not sure that the parties will not come back. First of all, because now there's not really a feeling that we do need actually parties with a personality. We do need politics. We do need ideologies, and not just this sort of complete sort of centrist, essentially sort of giant marshmallow. And it's the marshmallow that bites sometimes. And so I actually have started seeing, I now do a talk show on French news television, which is not as glamorous as it sounds. And we invite all sorts of politicians, and we're trying to sort of get even-handed, because we are forced by law to have the right one. Every expression is counted. The minutes are counted by the regulatory office. And so we invite all sorts of people that we might not invite so often otherwise. And so we've seen lots of old-fashioned politicians, including some of the Macronists, and you will realize that you really have to sort of bear in mind how badly Macron treated his ministers and his MPs. And you think some of the people who now are going to be kicked out, because it's a big wave. Let me try and get rid of the cat, because we're being interrupted by my cat. Go away.
I have a dog in the background of my kid's house, so we're being invaded by the animals, Anne-Elisabeth.
Well, and they would vote nicely, I think. More kibble, people, more kibble, and faster, please, faster. But anyway, so these politicians, that we saw these people, and they were perfectly reasonable people, and they had experience, and they'd been on the ground, and they were perfectly aware that they were going to lose their jobs. And even the Macron appointed Speaker of the National Assembly, Yael Braun-Pivet, who was told by the president on the phone, I'm dissolving the House. And she said, Monsieur le Président, ça n'est pas ce que la Constitution déclare. This is not what the Constitution says. It says that you have to have consultations with the Speaker of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, and we will do things according to the rules. And she was like many other politicians these past 2-3 weeks. She was the mouse that roared, because they didn't dare to do this. There's a French culture that you do not talk back to the king. And Macron was really, he was more than the king, he was Jupiter. So I have seen, I think I'm seeing sort of interesting movements within the legacy parties, and it's going to be horribly painful, and they're going to have to shed lots of people. But I'm more hopeful because the rally might very well get in. I mean, we're all sort of precipitating around the fact that it is difficult to predict. All the pollsters in the past 10, 12 days were saying we cannot get proper polls. But we are reaching the point, first of all, reaching the point where the data from all those constituencies has started being reanalyzed and sort of balanced, whereas at the beginning it was just projections from the European election, that it was no use. But the actual poll is going to be this Sunday. So the likelihood is that we are going to reach in this French system a sort of tilting point, which is not entirely different from what's going to happen in England on Britain on 4th of July, which is the sorry, cat, we are going to have probably a wave of national rally, and it's going to be like the pink wave of the socialists at Mitterrand in 1981. So they, there will be an opposition to these people. The hysterical sort of extreme left will be in the house sort of shouting as loud as they can and trying to foster disorder in the streets. I mean, this is really what they have in mind. They're complete Leninists.
Well,
there will be a pushback from left-wing Republicans, Républicains. I mean, people who believe in the institutions of the Republic. So I don't think those parties have disappeared. I think once you're in power, you're going to get in a position someday. It is probably a healthy thing that the opposition is in the house and not in the streets. And also because, like every catch-all party, which at this moment in time, the National Rally is, and it will not be forever. Right now, it is almost like the Gaullist party, which is cross-party, cross-class, cross-everything when it created itself in the 60s. It's going to change. More is going to sort of come out of it. And we are probably going to go back to normal politics. I know that whenever we had an old-style politician like former Prime Minister Jean-Pierre Raffarin, a moderate, a right-winger with a sort of a great fondness for China, but essentially a man with experience on the ground, he was so reasonable that we got feedback. We get feedbacks from the viewers, and they liked him. And they haven't seen anybody like him for so long. They haven't seen somebody older or fatter or sort of non-Parisian on TV for 7 years almost. And the result is that I'm not hopeless.
Well, let me ask. Now, I'm going to turn this question over to Daniel here and ask him, put it this way. Obviously, as you've both more or less said, whenever you have a party like the National Rally likely to come to power, there's a great deal of anxiety expressed of, has it really changed? Will it govern in a democratic way? And I wonder whether the question shouldn't be asked also from the other direction, particularly in view of the development of Giorgia Meloni's politics. And that question would be, when they get into power, won't these parties actually disappoint their supporters by just simply going along with a slightly altered version of the policies that Macron and others over the other previous governments have pursued over the years? Are you? This I'm addressing initially to Daniel, then I'll ask you in.
Yeah, I have a quick response for this one, but Meloni is the shining grail for the National Rally, who were not half as sophisticated as other European right-wing parties. And they've been walking back from some of their status promises because of Meloni. Bardello has been moderately better on Ukraine because of Meloni, and she's changed the entire outlook because she is successful.
Yeah. Yes.
But Daniel, and I have more to say, but afterwards.
Okay, Daniel, over to you.
Well, I agree with what Anne-Elisabeth just said. And I agree with what she said, that don't count some of the major figures of the legacy parties out. Bellamy, for example, from Les Républicains, he's conservative-minded, he's smart. I met him last year in Paris. He's got a future. God knows where. What's that?
He's wonderful. I mean, he is a thinker. Wonderful. He's multilingual. He gives speeches in the European Parliament in German and English.
He actually thinks Catholic. He thinks seriously. He's a genuine conservative in Les Républicains. He thinks he knows history, political philosophy. He has a sense of the tradition and the country that's worth preserving. And I suspect, I don't know the Glucksmann as well, but I think that impulse, especially if Franz and Sumis, I quite agree with your characterization of them as Leninists, when they will radicalize as a result of a national rally victory, and it will be an opportunity for the non-lunatic left to regroup. That will take time. John, what remind me of the specific inquiry you just made?
My argument was: is the danger instead of the danger of these conservative parties, these insurgent conservatives, being a threat to democracy, which is always the question that's put on from the media as well as from the left. Maybe the question is, are they going to become too much like the existing parties already in power, diluting the policies that have won them votes to the point that they become almost indistinguishable?
I think there will be a tremendous temptation to show that they've grown and become responsible. And even people associated with, and by the way, we all need to retire the extreme droite as a term for anything. Rod Dreher likes to say the non-traditional right, because the National Rally is not particularly extreme droite right now. Yeah, I think that concern is very real, because even these populist groupings want a certain kind of respectability from elite opinion, even as they're working to undermine the status quo. And I think, for example, as somebody who is more sympathetic to somebody like Bellamy, I think the National Rally doesn't show any sensitivity to some of the social questions that I think Europeans have to confront. There's a growing, if you spend time in France, you realize, you go to a Catholic church, you see a lot of families in their 20s and 30s. It's not the majority, it's anything close to majority, but there's a Catholic subculture of serious, literate, patriotic people who are going to help shape the future. And a group like National Rally has to speak to them too. If you're going to defend the integrity of France against Islamicization and against Europe behemoth, we have to know what France stands for. And France has some relation to its Christian past. But, Marine Le Pen always on, when it's all the whole series of issues related to gay stuff and LGBTQ, she wants to show that she's, socially and morally progressive and that kind of thing. And that was, of course, one major difference between Marie Marchal and Marine Le Pen, as Reconquest was about combining a certain kind of social conservatism and pro-family approach with patriotism and all of that. So I don't know. I think Anne-Elisabeth's point about think of all the early Gaullist movements, the RPF in 47, the Ralliement pour le peuple français, or the neo-Gaullists after 58. De Gaulle had this view, and maybe it was possible for brief moments with him at the head of a movement for national liberation and national refounding, of a rally of the French people. But in ordinary modern politics, you cannot sustain those large cross-partisan patriotic alliances. It's artificial after a year or two or three. And that's why the Gaullists were banalized over time. The movement, let's say, from de Gaulle to Pompidou was a quite dramatic one, because the Gaullists ceased to be high Gaullists, right? And so, yeah, I really do think with the National Rally, a lot of people who want a more nation-minded, more sovereign, less politically correct, less technocratic France, a lot of conservative-minded liberals and conservatives will support the National Rally. But as Anne-Elisabeth suggested, there's something a little unnatural about that kind of broad coalition. And so the return of ordinary partisanship is likely. It won't be a return to the status quo ante, but a lot of the same figures will be involved in the new configurations, but maybe some of the losers, like Macron, will be weeded out. I have contempt for Macron because I don't think he's a serious man. He pretends to be a serious man. He pretends, he when he expresses some affection for de Gaulle, it's always for the Jupiterian heights of de Gaulle's presidency. It's never for the substance. He doesn't have de Gaulle's substance. He's an empty suit, and his centrism is, and recently we've all saw this rhetoric, the Civil War, you have to vote for, you have to support Macron, you have to support me, or France will head towards civil war. It's not convincing. It really looks.
Well, let me intervene here and say that you've used the words civil war. I'm turning now to Anne-Elisabeth. One of the things which is interesting at the moment about politics and very worrying is that in all of our countries, acts of violence are becoming more common in politics, more used in politics, and sometimes more tolerated by the law enforcement authorities. And this has to be something that should alarm us. Now, let me ask about France here specifically, and this is addressed to Anne-Elisabeth. Does she see violence as becoming a more significant political factor? And if so, where does she fear it most?
Violence and everyday violence, which is also political, has increased, and it is one of the first worries of ordinary citizens. Because we were talking about the National Rally. I mean, the National Rally are going to be part of something that is so far beyond themselves. I'm not entirely sure they're getting the full measure of it. And there's a very clever analyst and pollster called Jérôme Fourquet, and he started writing about those parts of France which are the equivalent of Trump America. And he's also started about the concerns of people and the fact that not only are the concerns not heard, but people are told that they haven't seen this and they're making this up. About 5 minutes before we started recording, I was watching a clip from an interview of a National Rally candidate in Corrèze, which is a département that was both Jacques Chirac's constituency was, and also where François Hollande's constituency is. The former president, who's a moderate, in many ways a very respectable man, a socialist, decided that he would join the new Popular Front, the left-wing alliance, to sort of bring it back to the center, probably. I'm not even sure he's going to be elected. It would be very amusing if that nice lady who was speaking to the young television journalist was elected, because he was interviewing this lady. She's in her late 50s or something. She's got pearls on her jacket, and she is also local. You can tell from her accent. And she was, and she said, we worry about violence, we worry about our children being attacked at school, and we worry about being invaded. And of course, that is a red flag to the journalist who says, but how can you tell? And they're on the marketplace of a place near Tulle. And she says, well, they're not awake at this time, but they come later. And of course, we have all the demonstration of horror of somebody who believes in his ideas and doesn't believe that somebody who's lived there all her life has seen things. And he says, but how can you tell? And she says, look, I know the people who have no jobs. I know the people who start ambling in the streets until late at night and create trouble, and we see them. And he says, Madame, you are responsible for what you're saying. I mean, I have no party with this, and concludes. She's gained lots of votes in her constituencies if they were watching, because presumably there's a minority. It doesn't take many people to create trouble. I think William Bratton, when he started working on New York City in the early 90s, said you can have a neighborhood of 100,000 people in Queens, and it will take 200 youngsters to make it a complete hell to live in. So you don't need a majority of people like that. What happens in those areas in France is the first people to leave are people who themselves were immigrants not so long ago, but they've started making better. They can afford to move somewhere else, and they run. All of this is a reality that America knows quite well about. The French citizens on the ground, when they live next to it, they know exactly what it's like, and it has been not only denied by the everybody, the media, most politicians, you don't know what you're seeing, and you're just being racist in openly or just being hinted, like this young man coming all the way from Paris a minute ago. The notion of violence is something that has snowballed, and it has snowballed into everyday life, and not just in our society. You've got road rage, you've got people, not necessarily because of questions of immigration, but who will react by violence in days when they would just shout at one another in a shop, wherever. And that's pervasive, but there's also a feeling that it's being negated, and it's the one thing that people take the most seriously, the fact that nobody seems to want to enforce. The French police is nowhere like the Met in London, because they are not woke. And the worry of everyone, including myself, is that they are so exhausted, overworked, that we know that now the majority of them vote for the National Rally, and they will probably allow themselves the conduct which is going to be counterproductive. Not all of them, but we know perfectly well. I've spoken with préfets who themselves have got a great sympathy for them, but say that your problem is not a woke problem. Your problem is not the police force not enforcing the law. Your problem is that the police force is being told by activist judges that there's no room in prisons anyway, and as long as these people are not recidivists, they sort of, they free them. Every single cop I've met, after 5 minutes, tell me, look, I arrest this guy. He's been shoplifting. He's been grabbing handbags from women in the streets, and he tells me, as I take him to the Black Maria, that he doesn't care, because in 3 days' time he will be freed again after seeing a judge. That's a massive worry, and every intellectual you meet will give you accurate but sort of explanations that are not to the point. This is the situation. We can't do better, because that's the way it is. It is true. We haven't got enough prisons built. We haven't got the justice, and the justice system is clogged up with so many cases that it's too slow, and therefore the assumption that inefficiency is the only acceptable solution has penetrated absolutely everyone. The people do not like it. It is much more than culture wars, which are far less important in France. They've started, people have fostered them, but I don't think they interest so many people outside Paris. That is the public order is one of the things that worries people. The cost of living is what worries people. The abortion law was passed under a conservative president in 1975 by Simone Veil, the health minister, who was an Auschwitz survivor, with great debates in the House that were sometimes difficult, but essentially it is something that's accepted left and right in France. And that's not something that you can bring up again. It's entirely different. Even the Catholics take it as say, it is not desirable and it would be much better, but no election is going to be fought on that. We are a different country with different history. That's one thing. Putting it into the constitution is a piece of crowd pleasing, woke pleasing, sort of Americanism. That doesn't belong to essentially French political tradition. I don't think it's going to get into the constitution. It is like the bill on assisted dying at the end of life, which had evolved into not being such a bad bill as in Belgium, to be honest, but that's gone. And nobody is going to sort of, try and run this when there are much more urgent things to do in the short window when you can pass the maximum bills, and then you get clubbed up in the process. And the fact that your opposition, which was completely sort of frozen in terror, is sort of waking up. So we know that that's gone. But I would say that that's not going to exist. I worry about the National Rally, even watching Giorgia Meloni, because quite honestly, and I know people at ECR, the European Conservatives and Reformists, I see them regularly in it's the European group of all conservative parties that are not really hard right, like AfD in Germany, for instance. And the ECR has got Meloni, it's got Poles, it used to have the Tory party. They're still associated to the Tory party. They're also associated to Likud in Israel. They are a jolly bunch of people who know their stuff, mostly. And we don't have that kind of personnel in France. We don't have the French are not very clubbable by national, I would say, bent. but also because to be clubbable, you need to be able to chat with people, and not many people in France in politics speak good enough English that they can enjoy chatting with their counterparts in different nations, and they are signally sort of weaker in international parliamentary associations just because of that. Marion Maréchal is an exception because her English is impeccable, her Italian is impeccable, and she's quite different. And I totally agree with you that she has the understanding of the Catholic underpinnings of the country, the fact that you have to have a sort of moral and historical background in order to embody something. She was briefly with Éric Zemmour. They fell out for various reasons that are entertaining but too long to explain. And she has gone back to supporting the national rally of her aunt, Marine Le Pen. She's not going to join the rally. The reason she left is that her aunt treated her like the little girl she brought up. And Marine Le Pen doesn't like much independence around her. And the result is that she will create a micro-party, and the micro-party will essentially support the rally. And you're quite right too, that when you go to church in France, which I do, there are families, there is enthusiasm. These are good people. These are people who volunteer. These are people who essentially have the social sense. They're not extremists. They're sometimes shocked by extremists. They were briefly in love with Éric Zemmour because he was expressing a number of things about French history and French religion that no other candidate dared to express. And then Zemmour, the minute Ukraine...
Well, can I intervene at this point? And because this I was going on to this question of, is there any sign of a new kind of French identity, a super identity which encompasses all Frenchmen and French women in a way that makes social life at the bottom, in the society as a whole, easier, more natural? People feel they are one of another. There's a fellowship that unites all French people. It seems to me that's something which the Americans certainly have. It's now disappearing. Seems to me that it's something the British certainly had, different kind, but nonetheless it was there. And that is now seriously fractured. Now, when we turn to France, France was in a sense the first country, going back to the French Revolution, which developed a political identity, covered the whole country, which replaced another one. Now, as we know, of course, the culture wars in France over the splits between Republican and Catholic went on for a long time. But what is there now that, or is there any prospect of a unity being established among French people? Because we're talking about all kinds of divisions: religious, philosophical, political, and one has to say ethnic and racial. So, what do we see coming out of that?
Let me begin here. De Gaulle certainly saw that as the problem. He began his Mémoire de Guerre. He has a Idée certaine de la France, and his great project, in a way, he's a Catholic conservative general from an old monarchical family whose father thought, on the level of facts, that Dreyfus was innocent and was a Dreyfusar. He defended the Republic while having, you might say, an appreciation of the 40 kings who made France. France had a very peculiar separation of church and state after the Dreyfus affair. So the separation of church and state included the outlawing of all the religious orders and schools. De Gaulle was educated for right up to the war, when going off to the military academy at his father's Jesuit school, which moved from Paris to Belgium. And then, the two Frances came together during the war under the kind of Republican Jacobin Clemenceau, the Union Sacrée. But I think de Gaulle, his idea, it was a different France in a way. The traditional France was more Catholic. The left, there were certainly the Republicans of the Third Republic who were Comtean and Kantian, represented by the school teachers. And then, of course, you had this new left, looking to Moscow and revolutionary socialism. So France is a different country now, sociologically. The right and left have changed. Now, Mélenchon's party, I think, they're hard-headed leftists who are deeply nostalgic. They want to finish what was began only rhetorically in May 68. But I do think if you had not this faux centrism of Macron that claims, to bring people together on the basis of, well, nothing, you need public figures who can speak of France, not just Europe. As a friend of mine once said, there are other letters in the alphabet. It's not always, Europe, Europe, Europe. How about a little France along the way? You need to show respect, I think, for Republican values, because Catholic conservatives want the Republic too. And you have to realize that the morality that is, and this is, I agree with Anne-Elisabeth about the non-resonance of some of the culture war issues. On the other hand, you did have that huge rally against the imposition of same-sex marriage. They're not going back there, but France is a country where I talked to a lot of Frenchmen they kind of forget that wokeism has something to do with the pensée de 68 and the leftist atmosphere of 68 and the importation of postmodern nihilism to the American Academy. So it's just sort of this American disease. Look at those Americans again. No, it's also a French and European disease. But there's many, many Frenchmen I speak to who really, I was speaking to Raymond Aron's daughter, Dominique Schnapper, a few weeks ago, 89, a very sensible woman. She's got a new book out, which is about the degeneration of democracy into extreme equality and extreme relativism. And she just said to me, we gotta, she says, people have to realize that the decencies and morality that we share, that we want to defend against the woke, are shared by Republicans and by Catholics. And that is a really interesting insight Dominique made, because it means those old divisions are less important than, some kind of coalition in defense of civilization, common sense, and rejecting what the late Roger Scruton called the culture of repudiation. I think the culture of repudiation is there with the high intelligentsia, with some French radical thinkers. You got Alain Badiou still defending communism, but I think the culture of repudiation is not taken over in France the way it's taken over in American schools. So there is room
in England too. Yeah.
I think there's a place for bringing sensible opinion together, and but that work's still ahead of us, and it's going to involve an intellectual and spiritual recognition that there are reservoirs of moderation and common sense shared by an awful lot of Frenchmen across the political spectrum. And I was going to say, go back to the question of political violence. There's always been this problem of France. The system's too oligarchic. French public opinion always showed too much sympathy for trucking strikers blocking highways and, the first weeks of political protests, because they see that as part of the democratic process. But if France and their crazies declare war on a new government of the right and really carry out their frenzied Leninist passions, I don't think they're going to have the sympathy of the broad public, because they're going to be seen as destructive and nihilistic rather than serving some democratic purpose.
We have to end in a moment, so I want to ask you both the same question. And it's really to do about the impact that the elections and the results of the elections we're going to have over the next 2 weeks might have, or could have, arguably should have, on the correlation of political forces in Europe as a whole, and in particular in the European Parliament. Because what we've seen in the last week, really, has been that the grand coalition politics, which is spread across Europe in response to the rise of the right, is very much decided to entrench itself and resist any of these reforms. any of the changes which are advocated by the people voting for insurgent conservative and Christian democratic parties. If that's the case, and I think it is, then what impact could these election results have in challenging that? Because it does seem to some observers, I'm one, that there is a kind of frozen element to this in our politics, which essentially is a roadblock to sensible adjustments and reforms, and is as if they're frightening major politicians, major political movements are frightening themselves with turnip head ghosts and using that fear, which they've generated themselves, to block any kind of movement in politics, so that the politics of the last 40 years or so are stuck, and somehow or other we don't quite know how to get out of the maze. I'll ask you first, Daniel, if you can also be quick in relation to this. I know it's a tough question to be quick about, and then I'll ask Anne-Elisabeth to wind up.
Well, I think in the long run, if the European People's Party grouping and the European Parliament continues this way, totally unresponsive to the concerns of voters, in the end, there's lots of conservative elements in that parliamentary grouping, but the default position is always tepid and always accommodating to the European project in its most bureaucratic and least reformist mode. And I think things will catch up with them eventually, because this idea that the fundamental threat to European values comes from l'extrême droite, it is not compelling or convincing anymore. And so I don't think this kind of pretending nothing has changed and we're defending democratic values. I think one thing is when political movements, parties that speak for patriotic values, that attack the European project in its dominant or present form, when they start winning elections in serious countries, you can't say you're saving democracy by a totally politically accountable resistance to popular demands for change. What Anne-Elisabeth was talking about in the French countryside, the rural areas, the smaller towns, things that people see with their own eyes. And when journalists and political leaders tell them this isn't happening, or it's somehow wrong to point it out, it's not a viable situation. So I'm not at all surprised by the short-term response of the major, some kind of alliance of the socialists and the EPP, but I don't think it's a viable long-term option. And I think this, we hear the same rhetoric in the United States, saving democracy by, in a way, ignoring the will of the people or even criminalizing our politics. It doesn't, Europe just gave a Saving Democracy Award to Donald Tusk in Poland. Well, Donald Tusk has not acted very democratically or liberally since being elected. He's harassing the opposition, and he's being applauded as a model Democrat and liberal for doing so. This can't go on. It begins to smack of open Orwellianism.
Yes, thank you very much. And for the final word on that and other points, Anne-Elisabeth.
Well, thank you. It's just easy peasy, very easy to talk about this. It's a complicated issue, and my theory, which is that there's like Tolstoy's Unhappy Families. I mean, European populists and European non-populist are each non-populist and populist in their own peculiar way, and that is one of the reasons why you can bring them together with sort of interests in a vote. But I don't think you can bring them together, and perhaps it's a good thing, except on certain areas, Ukraine being one, to agree on something. And quite honestly, one of the things that are being reproached to the EU are uniformization of everything. This is the thing that people feel very strongly, is that the soul and the particularities of their country, of their towns, of their culture, of the history they learned at school when they were children, which is not the history that's being taught to their own children. This is something that they react very strongly about. And bringing something together is going to take a bit of more imagination than saying we have a blueprint for everything. that there should be ad hoc associations of European conservative parties, each on something that they feel strongly about and on which they have enough common ground that it's not going to be sort of, a series of declarations that in the middle that are going to mean that much to not anyone. I think that's the only way to go about it. I also, we were speaking about, the state of France in this, how we do over the complete chaos that we're going to sort of witness, even without riots. I've no idea, but, it's going to be interesting to watch. Quite honestly, I think Daniel was very right to say, and I'm sure that exists in other countries, that there is a sort of overarching feeling of what the country is, of what the combination of Republican values and the tradition of history in France, where, the 40 kings and the cathedrals and many things can be brought together, as long as it's not a point-scoring way of doing it, but as it's something that will inspire people and saying, look, we have lots in common, we should be proud of it. It is not to tell other people it's bad, their stuff is not as good as ours. There's no ranking in culture, there's no ranking in this. However, we have something that we're very happy and we find precious. And that is such hard work right now. And I look at Western Europe education systems, which have been quite bastions of destroying absolutely everything, even mathematics in France. I've been told that parents now who try to help their kids learn mathematics, rehearse, work on their mathematics homework to prepare them from school, find a different vocabulary, and that some teachers say, look, the vocabulary has changed because that way the parents cannot help the children, and there's equality between the children of parents who are illiterate and equality with the children of bourgeois. And that's ideology brought to a destructive extreme, just changing the way you look at arithmetic and geometry in order to create equality. And when you say, the wokeism has also infested France in those ways, and in ways which are incredibly difficult to walk back, because the children, meanwhile, have gone through 11 years of schooling in which they've been taught things that do not relate to the country anymore. So that's a real problem. I would say that in many ways, finding good ways of sort of bringing back education in something that takes into account everything that has been found since the time we were at school, but methods that will help children sort of accumulate something without being discriminated upon against on one side or the other is something that would be a good movement to start. And that the examples, many of the examples could be in Eastern Europe, because Eastern Europe has conserved for historical reasons an old-fashioned system that we can see. And I've met lots of students, for instance, in Hungary recently, and I know how much more cultured they are. I remember American friends, I lived in America in the early 90s, and professors saying in places like Montclair and Princeton saying, we've seen the Russians arrive, and my gosh, are they cultured? The kids know so many things that our kids do not. So we could find something that would work possibly in that direction, saying, look, we're trying to sort of create excellence again. We're trying to create culture again, the joy of it, the success of it. There is quietly a sort of world sort of movement in the secret society of opera lovers, because there's no way you can fake opera. Even if you have a completely nihilistic staging, you still will have musicians that know the highest, that have to play to the highest standards. That's the way. I mean, it's true. It is political. It is immensely political, and it is something that could bring people together with subsidies, a sort of super Erasmus, whatever. And that would be one way of bringing people together that would make everyone happy, which Daniel said so rightly, is as long, and you said so rightly, is as long as you have something that pulls people together, something in harmony and not in strife, you will find more people getting into it, and it will be more difficult to call you a fascist.
I will just add to what you have both said on that last point that you particularly said, Anne-Elisabeth. If you want to look at some of the most piercing and persuasive criticisms of wokeness, you probably would not go to speeches by politicians, even perhaps to articles by distinguished philosophers. You would go to the theatre, because you have had in the theatre with some of the works of people like David Mamet criticisms of this movement, which, because they are criticisms in the form of a persuasive and powerful narrative in which you care for people, it changes minds in a way that those of us who are talking heads haven't always been so successful in doing. I exempt, of course, the two talking heads I'm talking to now, because I want to thank you both very much. And to tell our viewers, this is about tomorrow's election. On next Tuesday, we will be reuniting with Ethel Seuss, the distinguished Hungarian scholar of French civilization. And then the following week, alas, we will miss you, Anne-Elisabeth, because you will be on vacation, and you will miss me because I will be at a conference in the United States. And Daniel, you will be discussing this with Esther. And I will be the point of continuity. You will be the point of continuity, and I'll be following it with great interest. Thank you very much indeed, both of you. Many thanks. Look forward to seeing you soon.